Welcome back, everyone. Chapter 13 is an abnormally short chapter, so we're going to do sections 13.1, 13.2, and 13.3 all together in this video. So in this video, we're going to be talking specifically about the spinal cord, both its structure and how it functions. Every year, we have thousands of Americans who are paralyzed by spinal cord injury. And when that injury happens, this information highway that connects the brain and the body is permanently usually damaged. So in this chapter, we're going to be talking about the spinal cord and the spinal nerves. Starting with section 13.1, we're going to be talking about the three main functions of the spinal cord. We'll be talking about its overall structure and its microscopic structure. And then we'll trace the pathways of nerve signals that go up and down the spinal cord. So we've talked before that conduction is one of the properties of neurons. So conduction happens when the nerve fibers send both sensory and motor information up and down the spinal cord. When we talk about neural integration, what we mean is the ability of the spinal neurons to get input, to get information from multiple sources, to make sense of it through integration, and then carry out the proper functions. So one example of this is being able to control our bladders and when we go to the bathroom. Next, our spinal cord is responsible for locomotion. The groups of neurons are able to coordinate the complex repetitive sequences of muscle contraction and relaxation that are required for walking. And finally, our spinal cord has reflexive actions, and these are involuntary responses. We don't control them, we don't plan them. Involuntary responses to stimuli. And these reflexes help us to maintain our posture and coordination and protect us from injury. So, starting from the very beginning with the surface anatomy of the spinal cord. The spinal cord is a cylinder of nervous tissue. It starts up in the brainstem, coming through the opening in the skull called the foramen magnum. The spinal cord occupies the top 2/3 of the vertebral column, and its inferior margin is found at your first lumbar vertebra, or sometimes just a little bit beyond that first lumbar vertebra. So in between that foramen magnum and your L1 vertebra, your spinal cord is typically about 1.8, almost 2 centimeters thick, and it varies a little bit with height, but generally about 45 centimeters long, or about half a meter long. And over that length, it gives rise to 31 individual pairs of spinal nerves. We can define a segment of the spinal cord as a part of the spinal cord that is supplied by a pair of spinal nerves, and we'll see some pictures of that in just a minute. Okay, so getting a little deeper into anatomy here, we can talk about the longitudinal grooves, and these are found on both the anterior and posterior side. The spinal cord is divided into 4 distinct regions. So we have the cervical region up here where the cervical vertebrae are. And then you guys will all remember the thoracic vertebra. So we have the spinal cord division of the thoracic region, and then the lumbar region, and then the sacral region. And then we have 2 places on the spinal cord that are extra wide in diameter. So that's up at the cervical enlargement and then down at the lumbar enlargement. An interesting piece of anatomy of the spinal cord is the cauda equina. So the cauda equina starts up here at L2, so there's your L1, and then L2 is right here, and extends all the way down to your 5th sacral vertebra, so all the way down to this fused portion of your vertebral column that articulates with your hip. This cauda equina is a bundle of nerve roots that take up the space of the vertebral column, and we'll talk about it more in detail in a few minutes. So we have to recognize the importance of the meninges. The meninges are 3 layers of membranes that enclose and surround the brain and the spinal cord. So one of their roles is to provide a barrier between the soft tissue of the central nervous system and the bones of the cranium and the vertebral column. So we have 3 layers. The most superficial, the closest to the surface, the closest to the bone, is the dura mater. The middle one is the arachnoid mata, and then the most interior one, closest to the brain and closest to the spinal cord, is the pia mater. A birth defect that used to be more common is less common now. Spina bifida comes from when the vertebra don't form a complete arch and don't enclose the spinal column completely. So there's a range of severities of spina bifida. It can range from very severe, and that form can be called spina bifida cystica, or it can be much more mild and have very little consequence for the child as it grows up. So typically this happens in the lumbosacral region, where the L vertebra and the S vertebra are found. It's caused by deficiency in folic acid, which is a B vitamin, in women during pregnancy. So one of the things that's interesting, this closure of the vertebral arch around the spinal cord happens very, very early in gestation, often before the mother even realizes she's pregnant. And so taking, for instance, prenatal vitamins, starting at the time the mother realizes that she's pregnant, it's too late. This birth defect may already be set up if the woman was deficient in folic acid. So one of the ways that we've combated this as kind of a society is we add folic acid to our flour. And so if you ever see enriched flour, it's enriched with folic acid. And that way, less women in the overall population are deficient in folic acid, and we have a decrease in the number of this spina bifida congenital defect. So this is that very severe form, the spina bifida cystica, and the spinal cord is protruding from the lumbar and sacral region there. So if we look at a cross-section of the spinal column, we can see a butterfly-shaped area of gray matter. Okay, so that's this butterfly-shaped area of gray matter, and it's surrounded by white matter. Okay, so white matter is on the outside there. And these two things have very different structures. So the gray matter, the neurons that make up that butterfly-shaped region, typically have very little myelin sheath covering them. This is where information gets processed and where the synapses are integrated. The white matter has lots and lots of myelination. So this is the area where signals are carried across, up and down the central nervous system. So going a bit more deeply into the gray matter, okay, so again, butterfly or H-shaped in the core, we talk about structures, dorsal horns, and kind of those protruding, maybe butterfly wings, if we wanted to go with the butterfly analogy. And then also a pair of slightly bigger ventral horns. Okay, so those are the things making up the maybe top and bottom wings of the butterfly, if you can visualize that. the center part, we call this the gray commissure. Okay, so maybe the body of the butterfly. That's what connects the left and the right sides. And a little bit more information about the white matter. So remember, the white matter is highly myelinated. It's very good for conducting signals very quickly. It's made up of columns that are made up of 3 pairs. So we have the dorsal, the lateral, and the anterior columns on each side. So 2 of these, 2 of these, and 2 of these. And then subdivisions or tracts of each column. So I just mentioned spinal tracts. Here's a bit more information about that. The fibers in a tract all have a similar place of origin, a similar destination, and a similar function. And so they kind of work together. The ascending tracts, not surprisingly, carry information to the brain, and the descending tracts carry information from the brain to the rest of the body. A couple other terms that are important here. Decussation is when the signal crosses the midline, and so the tracts in the brain control the opposite side of the body. I think you guys have probably heard this, like the left side of your brain controls the right side of your body. This is where that happens, in these spinal tracts. So the ascending tracts are carrying information up the spinal cord to the brain. So from the nerves that are sensing out in the body up to the brain. We have 3 orders of neurons here. The first order neurons are detecting stimulus and transmitting that information to the spinal cord. The second order neurons go from the thalamus up to the brainstem. And then the third order neurons take the information from the brainstem up to the cerebral cortex. So now we're going to talk about some of the individual tracts of the spinal column. So the first one, this one is a little hard to pronounce, the gracile fasciculus. This carries signals from the mid-thoracic, so the middle part of your rib cage, and from the parts of the spinal cord below that. So from T6 and down. This is the lowest or most posterior part of the column, and it integrates with the cunate fasciculus, hard word to say, at T6. So these are first order nerves. They're taking information from the body to the spinal cord, and then they terminate at the gracile nucleus of the medulla oblongata. So these nerves are going to be carrying different signals, signals for vibration, for deep touch, being able to tell the difference between hot and cold, visceral pain, and proprioception, or understanding the relative positions of our lower limbs and lower trunk. Extending from T6 and up, here we're going to talk about the portion of the vertebral column, the cunate fasciculus. Okay, so this kind of is the extension anterior to the gracile fasciculus. Okay, so this is going to be gathering signals from the upper limb and the chest. And again, it takes those signals to the medulla oblongata. And these are going to be second order neurons of the gracilis and cunate nuclei decussate. The third order neurons go from the thalamus to the cerebral cortex. And next we're going to talk about the spinothalamic tract. So the spinothalamic tract is part of the anterior lateral system, and it passes up the anterior and lateral columns of the spinal cord. This one is going to be carrying signals for pain, temperature, very light touches, itching, tickling, and it's made of second order neurons. Okay, so a quick figure here. We're looking at the gracial fasciculus meeting up with the cunate fasciculus. Okay, cunate fasciculus, and sending the signals up from there past the thalamus and into the gray matter of the brain. So now we're going to look at some of the descending tracts. So the descending tracts are sending signals from the brain down the spinal cord, and they involve two motor neurons. Okay, so the upper motor neuron comes from the cerebral cortex or the brainstem, and it ends at the lower motor neuron, and then the lower motor neuron picks up. It's in the brain or the spinal cord, the brainstem or the spinal cord, and it moves on the axons extending out to the muscle or the other target organ that the neuron is going to be acting on. So the coracospinal tract is one of these. The coracospinal tract is very important for precise, fine movements. Think like handwriting or sewing. So we have pyramid structures. These are ridges on the anterior surface of the medulla oblongata. Okay, so those are here, the pyramid structures on the medulla oblongata. And those are the fibers for the system. Most of the fibers decussate in the lower medulla and form the lateral corticospinal tract. Okay, so this is that contralateral side that we talked about earlier. Some of the other descending tracts, it's good to be aware of. You don't necessarily need to memorize the details of these. The tectospinal tract comes from the midbrain region, the tectum region of the brain. It's responsible for reflexes of turning the head when unexpected sights or sounds happen. The lateral and medial reticulospinal tracts. Okay, so these things reduce transmission of pain signals. So very important when a person is experiencing pain. And then the lateral and medial vestibulospinal tracts. Okay, so these are specifically related to balance and the inner ear and controlling the extensor muscles that we use for balance. So there's a disease, ALS, used to be called Lou Gehrig's disease, and then polio, full name polio myelitis. These are two diseases that we observe when we have destruction of the motor neurons. And when those motor neurons are damaged, the skeletal muscles that they innervated atrophy. Okay, so poliomyelitis. I'm sure you guys have seen pictures or read something about the polio virus earlier in your biology careers. So for many years, polio was a very dangerous and feared virus that was very damaging to children. So when poliovirus attacked the motor neurons in the brainstem or the anterior horn of the spinal column, The resulting symptoms of polio were weakness, muscle pain, and then loss of reflexes. And this disease could progress to paralysis, muscle atrophy as muscles stopped getting signals from nerves, and eventually respiratory arrest. So if you guys have ever seen pictures of children laying inside of an iron lung that's physically breathing for them and pulling oxygenated air into the body, that's the consequence of respiratory arrest. So the virus was spread by contaminated water. So Lou Gehrig's disease, more properly named, maybe amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. So this is also caused by destruction of motor neurons and leads to atrophy of the affective muscles. And so sclerosis here means scarring. When we have scarring on regions of the spinal cord and the astrocytes are unable to reabsorb a specific neurotransmitter called glutamate. So we have a buildup of toxic levels of glutamate in the spinal cord and the tissues surrounding. So this disease starts with muscle weakness, difficulty speaking, slurred speech, difficulty swallowing, and uncoordinated hand motions. A hallmark of ALS is that a patient's ability to sense is not impaired, and also their ability to think and plan their intellectual functions are mainly intact. Moving on to section 13.2 from your textbook. Here we're going to be talking more specifically about the spinal nerves. We're going to be talking about the anatomy of nerves and ganglia kind of in general, and then how the spinal nerves attach to the spinal cord. We'll be talking about how the spinal nerves branch. We'll talk about the 5 plexuses of spinal nerves and what they generally look like. And we'll talk about some of the major nerves that come from each of those 5 plexuses. And then we'll examine the relationship of dermatosomes to the spinal nerves. In order to bridge the gap between the spinal nerves and the rest of the body, we use the spinal cord as a communication medium. When we talk about nerves, we're talking about cord-like organs that are composed of many, many nerve fibers, specifically axons, that are bound together with connective tissue. So this mix of nerves can contain both sensory and motor, afferent and efferent fibers. The nerve fibers that we find in the peripheral nervous system are surrounded by Schwann cells. Those Schwann cells form the neurolemma in the myelin sheath. That gets wrapped around the axon. The endoneurium is loose connective tissue that is outside of the neurolemma. The perineurium is a layer of overlapping squamous cells, so those kind of cube-shaped cells that wrap around the fascicles. So these create bundles of nerve fibers. Our next layer is epineuriums. So these are more irregular connective tissue that's denser, that goes around the entire nerve. And then we have blood vessels that are able to penetrate through these layers of connective tissue and provide adequate blood supply. The sensory or afferent nerves carry signals from sensory receptors, up to the central nervous system. And then the motor or efferent nerves do the opposite. They carry signals from the central nervous system back to the muscles and the glands. And like we just said, we have some things called mixed nerves that happen when the afferent and efferent nerves are together in the same bundle. Remember, we talked about the different subdivisions of both sensory and motor fibers. Okay, both sensory and motor fibers have both somatic and visceral divisions. When I say ganglion, what I mean is a cluster of neurosomas or nerve bodies that we find outside of the central nervous system. And these are wrapped up with one continuous layer of endoneurium. So this right here is pretty important for you guys. There are 31 pairs of spinal nerves, okay, and these are mixed nerves that we find throughout the body. So we have 8 in the cervical region, okay, we have 12 in the thoracic region, 5 in the lumbar region, 5 in the sacral region, and then 1 in the coccygeal region. So not surprisingly, these are associated with individual vertebrae. And they are in pairs, so one goes to the left of the body and the other goes to the right of the body. Each spinal nerve has 2 roots or proximal branches. There's the posterior root, and that's the sensory input. And then there's the anterior, sometimes we also call it the ventral, that is the motor output. And then remember we talked about the cauda equina, and this is formed from the roots between L2 and the coccygeal. Once the nerve has kind of exited the vertebra, the nerve is going to divide into distal branches. Okay, so we have the anterior ramus, the posterior ramus, and the meningeal branch. Those are the 3 main branches. Okay, so we have exited from the vertebra. We have the anterior ramus going this way. We have the posterior ramus going this way. And the meningeal branch is here, kind of staying close to the vertebra. So shingles is a disease that has been more well publicized in the past few years. So when someone has chickenpox, which for a long time was very common in early childhood, I had chickenpox in 2nd grade. It's caused by a virus called the varicella zoster virus. Okay, it produces an itchy rash. Generally not a lot of complications though. It's very contagious. When I got it from someone at school, both my brother and sister had it within a day. Generally though, it's not considered a super dangerous virus. There are some people who experience complications, especially if they get the virus, get chickenpox very young or after their teenage years. It's interesting that the virus remains for the entire rest of the person's life, housed in the posterior root ganglia. And it's kind of held there by the immune system. It's not allowed to cause any further disease unless the virus is allowed to travel down the sensory nerves by fast axonal transport at some point in time when the immune system is compromised. So if this happens, and if it's going to happen, it usually happens in someone who's older than 50. What happens is this painful rash, accompanied usually by nerve pain, found on just one side of the body, that is quite painful and itchy. So the way to prevent both chickenpox and shingles is to have a vaccine for chickenpox before a person actually has the chickenpox disease. It is possible to get a vaccine for shingles as well. So now we're talking about the nerve plexuses, and there are 5 nerve plexuses. Okay, so we have the cervical nerve plexus, the brachial nerve plexus, kind of at the border, the lower cervical vertebra to the very first thoracic vertebra. Then we have the lumbar plexus. This is in the lower back. And then the last 2 lumbar vertebra and the sacral vertebra help to make up the sacral plexus. And then the coccygeal plexus is associated with the 4th and 5th sacral vertebra, which are, of course, fused together in the coccygeal vertebra. So these plexuses carry sensory signals. Those signals can come from joints and bones, from muscles, from the skin. Also, these plexuses are very important in knowing the position of your own body. So looking here for a minute at the lumbar plexus, okay, so we can see the roots here are in purple, and then the anterior divisions are in kind of the turquoise color, and the posterior divisions are in the darker blue color. And then here we have the sacral and coccygeal plexus, so associated with the sacral L4, L5, sacral, and coccygeal. And we've got the same kind of structure. We have the roots, the turquoise interior divisions, and then the posterior division. And notice that this is coming into, these are coming together into the sciatic nerve. Okay, so the sciatic nerve is here, and that's going to extend down the leg. So nerve injuries can happen fairly frequently. One common one is the radial nerve injury. So the radial nerve passes through the axilla or the armpit. We see this a lot of times when a person is using crutches for an extended period of time, or if a person is using crutches wrong, like they have the crutches too high compared to their own height. And a symptom of this is the wrist will droop or will be hard to flex back because the nerve has been damaged. Also incredibly common is sciatic nerve damage. So sciatica is very common. It usually stems from a herniated disc. One of the discs between the vertebra can be herniated, or osteoporosis can cause compression of the vertebra. And this can cause pressure on the sciatic nerve, causing sharp pain in the hip all the way down to the thigh, the lower leg, and the ankle sometimes. So here we're talking about the cutaneous innervation. So we're talking about specifically your skin here and what nerves are associated with the sensations of your skin. So we can see that we call this the dermatosome map. And if a person is, for instance, experiencing numbness in their fingertips, we might focus in and examine if they're having a pinched nerve at C7. So wrapping up this video with section 13.3, we're going to be talking about reflexes, how reflexes are different from other types of motor action. We're going to talk about the general components of what we call a reflex arch, and then some of the common somatic reflex functions. So, for a good solid definition, a reflex is a fast, involuntary, stereotyped reaction. It can happen to a gland or a muscle after it's been stimulated. Okay, so if there's no stimulation, we will not have spontaneous action. We're using very few interneurons here, so very little synaptic delay, so the reflexes are quick. These are going to happen without our intent, and they're going to be really difficult to prevent from happening. And they happen the same way almost every time. So the one that we always talk about here is when the physician uses the little rubber mallet and taps on your knee and your lower leg bounces. Okay, so it happens quickly. You didn't make your leg jerk. It's going to happen the same way every time. And your leg doesn't do that unless it's stimulated to do so, in this case by the rubber mallet. In addition, we can have reflexes that involve secretion of something from a gland. We're more familiar with the ones that make your muscle contract, but these can involve secreting from a gland as well. Okay, so this is exactly what we're looking at here. We have the rubber mallet. It is tapping on the knee. Okay, and we're going to talk about the somatic reflex arch, the steps that happen in order to produce that knee-jerk reaction. So we have the somatic receptors. They're found in the skin, the tendons, the muscles, and the afferent nerve fiber that's going to carry information up to the spinal cord and then eventually onto the brainstem. We have the integrating center, and this is the connection point between the gray matter of the spinal cord and the brainstem, or the brainstem. And this is where the signal of the efferent nerves comes from. Then the efferent nerve fibers transmit the signal back to the muscles, and the effectors are the muscles that carry out the response, specifically the quadricep here in this case. So going back and remembering some of the information that we learned about muscles previously. Okay, so remember that a muscle spindle is the stretch receptor. Okay, so this is going to tell us when a muscle is being stretched possibly too far. Okay, we've also talked about this proprioceptors before. These are the ones that allow you to know the position of your limbs in relation to the rest of your body. Okay, so the muscle fibers or the muscle spindles are working to communicate with your brain how your body is moving and the length of your muscles. And these muscle spindles allow your brain to kind of have a comprehensive overview of what's going on and then coordinate the muscle movements, including voluntary and involuntary muscle movements, as well as your posture and reflexes to correct any over movements back to the body. So just to give you an example, what these muscle spindle fibers might do is if you're standing in a boat and the boat is rocking gently or even a little more than gently, your spindle fibers, your muscle spindles are going to be able to communicate with your brain the position of your body and the way that your body needs to move, both voluntary and involuntarily, to keep you standing upright. So the myotatic reflex is kind of a way of overcorrecting or bringing your muscle back after it is stretched. And this is going to be important in maintaining your equilibrium and your posture and stabilizing your joints as you're kind of balancing the motions of extension and flexion as you make various movements. So we've already talked twice about the patellar reflex. This is one of the coordinated responses of the afferent and then efferent nerves that is really easy for us to observe and can be really useful in diagnosing some diseases if we see a problem with that patellar reflex. So a little more detail about that patellar reflex. You guys can read that when you have a chance. We also have something that's a little bit different, a withdrawal or flexor reflex. So this is a quick contraction of flexor muscles that will pull us back from some sort of dangerous stimulus. So this causes the contraction of the flexor muscles with simultaneous relaxation of the extensor muscles. We also have tendon reflexes. Okay, so this is also related to the proprioceptors that are found in the tendons at the junction of muscle and bone. And these help us prevent a muscle contracting too strongly and causing damage to either the muscle or the bone. So going back to spinal cord damage, we know, statistically speaking, between 10 and 12,000 people each year are paralyzed by some sort of spinal cord trauma. Typically, this happens simultaneous to a fracture of a vertebra, and the group highest at risk for this type of injury is males in young adulthood. This is kind of correlated to motorcycle accidents and automobile accidents. Young adult males are more likely to be involved in automobile or especially motorcycle accidents, so these things go hand in hand. When the spinal cord is completely severed, we call that a complete transection. When that happens, all motor control below the level of that injury immediately happens. If this happens at C1, C2, or C3, we have the possibility of respiratory failure, as the diaphragm will no longer be innervated and allowed to work. We can see symptoms of spinal cord shock. We can also see various types of paralysis. So if both of the lower limbs are paralyzed, we call that paraplegia. If it's all four limbs with an injury in T1 or higher, that would be quadriplegia. When it's hemiplegia, that would be paralysis of either the left or the right side of the body. And finally, paresis is when we have partial paralysis or weakness in one or more limbs.